Peter Dutton, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks, Sarah.
Now, according to the AFP, the acting commissioner briefed you in 2018 about its corruption investigation into Mr Bojani. You say you've got no recollection or record of that. Are you categorically saying it didn't happen?
Well, Sarah, not just am I saying that the federal police don't have any recollection of or any detail of what was briefed, and that's the response they've provided to the government in a question on notice.
They are clear that the meeting took place. Are you saying the meeting did or didn't take place?
Well, I'm saying that we've checked our records. I don't have any record of it in my office. I don't have any recollection of having been briefed in relation to it, and the AFP have advised that they don't have any detail of what was briefed or the response or anything of that nature. The point I made today in my press conference was that in any case it's inconsequential because as Minister I have absolutely nothing to do with the procurement arrangements which under the Commonwealth guidelines are undertaken by the secretary or a delegate within the department.
Let me just come in on that. Let me just come in on that word inconsequential, because however you describe this set of circumstances, it is not inconsequential for the AFP to have a record of having briefed you on a corruption investigation of an individual who was shortly to be awarded further multi-million-dollar contracts by the Australian government. But
Sarah, as I say, whether it was Chris Bowen as a predecessor in the portfolio, or Brendan O'Connor or Tony Burke, none of the ministers, and today Claire O'Neill, has no say whatsoever in procurement arrangements.
Yes, that's not the question. The question in the first place is to be absolutely clear that you are saying this meeting didn't take place.
Well, I've been clear about that, and the reason I say that it's inconsequential is that the Minister of the day receives briefings, top secret briefings from ASIO, from the AFP, from ACIS, other agencies in relation to operations or individuals. The way that information is disseminated is for the agencies to provide a copy to the Secretary of the Department or to other officials across the Commonwealth with the appropriate clearance. They would have been given that information if it were available, and if the department makes a procurement decision or enters into a contract with somebody about whom there is intelligence available, that is an issue for the department.
All right, well, let's come back to that in a minute.
I think that's an important point to make.
We'll come back to that in a moment, what should or shouldn't have been done, but let's just be very clear about what we know here. So the AFP have made it absolutely clear that their records show there was a meeting. They don't hold notes about that meeting. You would expect, though, that the acting commissioner at the time, Ramsey Jabbour, would have his own notes of the meeting. It would clear it up if he would produce those.
Well, it's a question for the AFP, and no doubt those questions will come. I've asked to meet with the AFP Commissioner to get further detail. That has to go through the Minister's office, and she hasn't cleared that meeting as yet, but I'm happy to have that discussion with the AFP to get more detail. Because
so you'd be happy at this stage for those notes, if they are held by the former acting commissioner Ramsey Jabbour, for those notes to be made public or at least to be examined under the review that's been announced today?
I'm happy for. I mean, questions can be put to Mr Jabbour. He can provide his response in relation to his notes if they exist. And the briefing took place, then I have no problem with those being released. But that's a question and a decision for him, not for me. Well,
let's come back to that idea of it being inconsequential. You said that in any case you would have had no decision in awarding the contract to Mr Bojani. But if you had been briefed about an investigation that was taking place, an investigation of corruption of him, surely you would have been obliged to act on that information or pass it on.
But Sarah, the point I made before about the dissemination of the information is that those intelligence reports are available and they're disseminated to the Department of Home Affairs or the Department of Education or whoever it might be. So all of that information is available to them. And as I say, the department is the one making the decision around the procurement arrangements. Nothing has changed in relation to the procurement arrangements during the time that I was Home Affairs Minister compared to when Chris Bowen was.
Well, let us understand how the procedure works then. If you were in receipt of disturbing information like this, that a major supplier of services to the Australian government, and at this stage Mr Bojani had already received millions of dollars in taxpayers' money. So if you're informed by the AFP that he is suspected of corruption, you are under no obligation or feel no duty to discuss that with the people making the decisions?
Well, Sarah, again, I think you're reading a lot into the circumstance here. So,
in what way? Explain that.
Well, just to give you a sense, without going into other matters that I have very clear recollection of being briefed on, the sensitive matters, particularly involving foreign officials or people with whom the government has a relationship in the intelligence space. If there's an investigation, generally that would be at a very high level because, again, the Minister is not involved in the day-to-day decisions around an investigation. It would be just for an awareness that this individual is on the radar. There's an investigation underway because you have contacts with officials from that particular country. You should be aware of this. It may not even have been in the context of this individual is doing business with the Australian government.
But you had, let's be clear, he was already doing business with the Australian government. The AFP has come to inform you that he's under investigation for corruption. You weren't curious to know in the months that followed who had been granted the next very large multi-million-dollar contract and that it might have been someone whom the AFP was investigating for corruption.
Well, again, Sarah, I don't have any recollection at all. The AFP don't have any notes of having advised me of it. I don't believe that, having searched my records, that we have any note of it at all. So, in terms of what they said, that's obviously in dispute. It's an issue for the government or for the AFP to answer. I'm happy for them to provide that answer. But
and if the AFP comes forward and it turns out this meeting did in fact take place, do you stand by your claim that you did nothing wrong in never discussing it with the department?
Well, again, Sarah, if there was information provided to me, as I understand the meeting, as the government's reported it, the ABF Commissioner was there and an official from the Department of Home Affairs. So they were already in receipt of the information. The thought that, if your suggestion is that I'd received some information in relation to this individual and I hadn't conveyed that to the department, it's a complete false premise because...
Let me ask you this question more generally. Were these questions of corruption overlooked because of a culture of whatever it takes to maintain the system of offshore detention?
No, I just think there are some people who are completely and utterly obsessed against offshore detention, and so they grasp onto this issue and many others to try and prosecute that argument. And I just think they become, frothy at the prospect of there being a way to attack offshore processing.
I presume you're not accusing me of being frothy here. You're talking about the government.
Clearly there's no evidence, Sarah, that you are, but there are many commentators, particularly from the ABC and the Guardian and otherwise, that are. So let's be very clear about that. But the same procurement arrangements exist today under Minister O'Neill as they existed in my time, as they existed in Chris Bowen's time. There's nothing extraordinary in any of that. And
there's no question. I think there's no question the audience will find it extraordinary that a man who has been granted millions of dollars in contracts, who is under investigation for corruption, continues to receive contracts paid for by the Australian taxpayer. I think that is extraordinary by any calculation.
Well, and I've said today I'd be happy to sign a letter jointly with the Prime Minister to refer the matters off to the National Integrity Commission. The Prime Minister hasn't taken that offer up. If there are allegations that the Minister has to make, then they're properly investigated by the authority. If the department's made decisions to contract with somebody with the knowledge that that person has corruption issues or a cloud over their head, that's an issue for the department to answer because they're the ones who are involved in procurement decisions. But is this an opportunity for some to try and attack offshore processing, which is supported by both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party? Well, sure, and you're seeing some of that in the commentary at the moment.
And briefly, Scott Morrison gave a vigorous defence of himself in relation to Robo today. Would your job as Leader of the Opposition be a lot easier if Mr Morrison weren't there?
Well, again, Sarah, I mean it's the case that Mr Morrison has put a very strong case in relation to his position, his right to put it in Parliament and his right to serve in Parliament after having been elected at the last election. If he decides to retire, as I think I've said on the program before, whether it's him or Julia Gillard or Kevin Rudd or John Howard or whoever it might be, former Prime Ministers in our system of government, unlike in, say, the US, have, I think, a right to retire at a time of their choosing. I think that's a dignified way for them to exit the Parliament. Former Prime Minister Morrison's made a decision to stay in Parliament, at least for the time being, and that's entirely within his remit. So he's working hard for his local constituents, he's contributing to debates, and he's defended himself rigorously with what he believes is a very strong case that he's put in the Parliament today.
Peter Dutton, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.